Hello. We are going to be in Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. Again, it's going to be Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. It says, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, after the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in a field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Stay awake, be ready. You do not know the hour when the Lord is coming. Stay awake, be ready. The Lord is coming soon." If you've been around any sort of children's choir during your time at church, you've likely heard the song that stems from our text in Matthew. While the song is usually reserved for Advent, it seems pretty relevant to the time of need that we find ourselves in at this point. As you're all pretty aware, we've been called to shelter in place and practice social distancing due to the COVID-19 virus. So Baylor's campus is pretty empty and the streets are pretty much the same. So in a way, Waco has become a sort of a ghost town. And I don't want to make this out to be some sort of apocalypse. Rather, I would like to focus on what it means to be ready in light of all the things happening. So many of my close friends know that I am a terribly unprepared person when it comes to most aspects of my life, and that's been true during this time as well. I had no clue of what the virus was when spring break rolled around. And by the time I got back to Waco, everything seemed to be coming unglued. I had originally planned a big grocery trip whenever I got back, but by the time I got to the store, many of the essentials had been long gone due to panic. My disposition to not take the virus seriously at first led me to be unprepared as I settled in for the long haul here at my apartment at Waco. As it turns out, Little Debbie snacks can only last you so long, and the lack of toilet paper was truly frightening. But this situation is pretty typical of my life, where I end up in a pickle by procrastinating the things that I need to do. This happens with papers, planning projects, going to sleep, waking up on time, among other things. So being ready is by far not my forte, but there's more to it than that. My being unprepared is rooted in something much deeper in my life. More often than not, I find myself being stuck in the past, thinking about all the things that I could have done differently with my time. I often feel stuck in this cycle of wanting to do and be more, but instead of living the moment, I remain in my past mistakes, which continues the cycle. And this, unfortunately, has also made its way into my religious life. I have a hard time keeping up with my devotional readings and my journaling and my praying. Often enough, I don't seem to notice the Spirit moving in my life because I'm thinking of a mistake or someone that I overlooked. So if the Lord were coming tomorrow, I'm unsure if I would be ready or not. So the question that comes to my mind is, how do I live a life that is ready for the coming of the Lord? And how do all of you live your lives so that you're prepared for God to come? And how do we collectively prepare for this reality? And being prepared is a hard concept to grasp in this life. It looks different from person to person, but as we look to the Gospel of Matthew, we find a reason why we need to prepare that will help us in our entire lives. We come upon the scene of this text in the midst of things. We're halfway through a point that's being made by Jesus, and it's almost like walking in on a friend being chewed out by their parents. We don't get much of a glimpse of what's happening before after this text, but there's a couple of key things we should look at as we focus on chapter 24. So chapter 24 and 25 act as a sort of subsection to the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus takes time to talk to his disciples about the end times. Really no different from our time. The people are concerned about the future and what it will hold, especially after Jesus has just told them that the temple will be judged and destroyed. For the center of Jewish life to be destroyed meant a big deal to them, as it had during the past. As we recall, many of the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures, the judgment prophesied against Jerusalem resulted in the destruction of the city and the exile of the people. So for Jesus to say that the temple would be destroyed was a very big deal. And so the disciples understandably had a few questions. The disciples wanted to know exactly what was coming for them and when Jesus, and when. Jesus takes much of chapter 24 to talk about not being deceived by false prophets. And Jesus tells the disciples that there will be clear signs that point to the coming of the Son of Man. And they just need to be paying attention. So just as we see lightning from far off before the storm sets in, or the fig tree sprouts leaves before the summer, so too will the coming of man be. This brings us to our text today. We start with an answer to the question the disciples had early in the chapter. The disciples want to know when these things will be happening and what's going to be going on. And Jesus gives a very clear, I don't know. Isn't that comforting? No person on earth, nor the angels, nor Jesus himself knows, but God himself, God the Father alone knows. The people have no way of knowing when these events are going to happen, and Jesus really wants to drive home this point, and he does so by telling the story of Noah and the ark. Jesus directs us to Genesis 6 through 8, where we see Noah as a righteous man among a people that are considered corrupt. God comes to Noah and tells him of what is coming. God is tired of the sin and violence that the world has come to and is going to put a final stop to it. God comes to Noah and says that God's going to destroy everything and everyone. And so God commands Noah to build an ark and tells him that the earth will soon be flooded. And from this point, God wants to create a covenant with Noah because of the life that he's lived. And God wants Noah, but does not let anyone else in the secret. And Noah listens. Noah fully believes that God will do exactly as what is said, so he begins to prepare. He builds the ark just as commanded and gathers the animals and his family and shuts them up in the ark. The rain comes and the people of the earth are destroyed, and Jesus is saying, just as that happened, so it will happen again. Jesus says that the people of Noah's time had no clue of what was coming for them. They were living their life as normal. They were eating and drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage, and they were swept away. And despite seeing Noah build a huge ark and seeing him go about gathering his family and the animals, the people paid Noah no mind. They luckily blew him off as the crazy weird guy that every town has. But they ended up being wrong. So Jesus is warning his listeners to hear the lessons of the past here and live better and to live differently. We hear this echo for us in our time. We hear often from the spiritual leaders all around us about what it means to reflect Christ and to live a good life. And so the question is, how are we listening and applying those lessons? Are we living lives that are prepared for God to come into, to enter into? And this has been the lesson from the beginning of time, really. World history has often been a roller coaster of ups and downs, of being close to God and being far away. And when God tries to tell the age of what's happening and of the coming judgment, it turns out to be pretty bad. I'm reminded of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. I'm reminded of Amos prophesying destruction of Israel by the Assyrians. And I'm reminded of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. There's a very clear pattern here, and it's something that Jesus wants to take up again. And after he speaks about Noah, Jesus goes on to tell us, 2 men will be in a field, one will be taken, and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken, and one will be left. This emphasizes what Jesus was saying about the people of Noah's day. Jesus is saying that the people are going to be doing normal life stuff, and the people will be taken without warning, while some are left behind. Most of us don't work in a field and grind grain as part of our work, so this can be applied to many of our lives here. But the question that comes out is, what does normal life look like for you? as you embody Christ, are you able to embody Christ when you go to the grocery store and all the craziness? How can you be prepared for God as you have more time in your home with your families? This does not have to be made into an apocalyptic text, but it can be very easily created into something that can have new meaning for our lives. So being prepared for us can simply mean living like Christ. And we see in this text that one person is taken while the other is left. And while this can definitely be alarming, I think there's something more to this. Curtis Mitch and Edward Shree seem to suggest that Jesus is pointing to the idiom used by the prophets to speak about the faithful remnant that's left behind when destruction came. So Jesus is saying ignorance of what is coming would not save the people, just as it happened in all the Hebrew scriptures with the prophets. So Jesus says again, stay awake and be ready. We continue on into verses 42 and 44, where Jesus gives us another example of what this is like. He says, it will be like a thief coming in the night. If the owner of the house would have known at what time the thief was coming, the owner would have prepared and would have stopped the robber. Jesus points out yet again that we do not know where and when the Lord will come, but we are commanded to stay awake. It is important here that Jesus emphasizes what he was saying earlier in the chapter. No one knows what will happen, and there will be many people that come under false pretenses. We may not know when, but it's enough to know that the day is coming. And so it's really unhelpful to try and predict when this day will happen. And again, I think this is missing the point of what Jesus is saying. It takes great wisdom to prepare for the future despite not knowing when the Lord is coming or when the hour is coming. And if we knew the day or hour, we could simply prepare right before and continue to spend our lives being complacent and not living in a very good way that reflects God. This is something that we can't know. It is not something that Jesus seems to be very concerned about. And I think that's the important part. So as long as we prepare like we should, we really don't have anything to worry about. So Jesus calls us in verse 44, you must be ready. We see Jesus trying to battle the people of his time and getting them to live rightly ordered lives. He wants them to be prepared and to live well and to love God and others. Jesus is, in a sense, battling complacency and trying to drive his listeners to action. And these are words that we hear now in our lives. Jesus is not trying to make his people into doomsday preppers, but wants them to live differently. And similarly, we should not take this text to be connected to doomsday, but as something more than that. And it's really about how we are living our lives in light of God. So we must ask ourselves, in what ways are we complacent? In what ways are we not living rightly ordered lives? And what does a rightly ordered life even look like with all the craziness that's going on these days? I know these questions come and go in our lives, and especially in light of everything that's happening, that seems to be a pretty big question. For myself, these are questions that I've been slowly trying to figure out over the past year or so, but especially during the semester. So at the beginning of the semester, I was able to begin therapy with a counseling center here at Baylor. If you haven't checked them out, you should, because it's free. It's great. I wasn't sure what to expect when I began along this journey. Much of my experience with therapy has been limited or just not good in general. So I was unsure if this would be a good fit or what it, if it would actually do anything for me. But due to the urging of many of my friends and many of them sitting down and talking to me, I signed up and did all the entrance exams and met my counselor. It's an interesting experience in my case. For those of you that know what it is, I'm a 2 on the Enneagram, which basically means that I'm very used to taking care of others, usually at the expense of my own well-being. While that sounds like a brag, it's not. It's very unhealthy and exhausting, so don't do that. So I'm not used to taking care of myself, let alone being selfish and having a relationship that only focuses on my issues. But all I can say is thank God for counseling, because it's been a lifesaver. It's been very good being able to be selfish and work on myself. And we have dealt greatly with the past few years after the death of my brother. I thought that I had healed from everything that had happened, but halfway through the semester it became apparent that this was not the case. I did not have much of a chance to work through these emotions directly after it happened. So I took a week off, and after that week I went back and finished my semester. So in order to survive and take care of all the things that I needed to, I essentially numbed myself to everything that was going on around me. It was essentially like I was living on autopilot. So my therapist explained it like this. It's like receiving a cut on the arm that needed attention to be healed, but in order to take care of that cut, it would require pain. Pain of cleaning it out, of being sewn up, of applying ointments to help the healing process. It would be hard work. It would take time. And so instead of going through this process, I ignored it. It was much easier to not deal with these things and not have to experience any more hurt than I already had. But as the cut was left unattended, it's festered and become more of an issue than it should have been. She suggested that if I keep ignoring the problem, that it would only get worse. So I kind of came to a crossroads. I could do the hard thing and start dealing with my emotions, or I could do the other hard thing and continue on like normal. And friends, I know that I'm not the only one that suffers or who has lost someone. I know that many of you have felt the familiar sting of grief and death. And you know what it means to just want to be able to get through a day and survive. So I did just that. I've been floating through life, not really taking the time to be aware of everything that's going on around me. When I came across this passage, it moved me in a way that not much had been able to up to this point. I connected the passage to my therapy, and I realized that I hadn't been doing a very good job of being awake or being ready. I had not done a good job of being alert, and it's something that I wanted to be better at, to do better at. And while it's easy to wallow in my failures, Jesus is offering me a more excellent way. And just as my therapist told me that we were going to work through these emotions together, so Jesus comes alongside us and is preparing me for a better way of living. And it's not just a cheap thing to get me into heaven, but a real transformative way to experience life in a way that is worthy of being called by God. And this is truly what I see in this text. Jesus pleads with us to be ready for whenever God might come. And this is not just to save ourselves, but it leads to a life that is wholesome and full. It leads to love and wisdom. It's a hard journey, but God gives us courage on the way to our destination. It's about taking the gifts that God has given us and using them well. It's about living the life that God has set before us. So there's beauty in this realization that despite past traumas and mistakes, Jesus tells us to be prepared, and it is never too late to start on this journey. And Jesus extends this call to all of us here, and really to anyone that's listening. So my question is this: where is this text meeting you? Have you been spending much time looking inside yourself and taking an inventory? If you have, do you like what you see? Do you think God likes what is there? Do you think you're prepared for God to come here and now? If you're anything like me, the answer is probably not great. This is not a cause for alarm or anxiety. There's grace for all of us that we are trying to live out a life in line with our calling. We only need to turn to God and decide how we are going to live. I'm very aware that it's more easily said than done, but there are practical steps that we can take to start along this journey. First is spend some time alone and reflect on who you are and who you're becoming, which is rich coming from me. I'm very extroverted. I don't like spending time alone. But spend time alone. Ask yourself, who am I? Do you reflect Christ in your inner being? The second, examine your behaviors and reactions to the people around you. Ask yourselves, are the relationships in my life healthy? Am I reacting in good or negative ways? Am I losing patience over small things? And the third, take time to take care of yourself and work on your life. ask yourself, what can I do to help myself out? And what can I do to embody Christ more? This might look vastly different from person to person. For me, it means going to therapy and spending more alone time reflecting on myself and working towards healing. And this is my version of being prepared and staying alert in this life. But it can also look differently for you. It can look like self-care that you do throughout the week. It can mean having a heart-to-heart with a strained relationship and finding common ground and reconciling that relationship. It can mean doing something new and interesting to pull you out of complacency. It can mean picking up a new hobby, cooking more, volunteering during the week, or doing anything that draws us closer to God and closer to people. It might mean figuring out new ways to pray and read Scripture. And at the end of the day, this is where we'll find what it means to be truly awake and live a life that's prepared for God to come. It means experiencing life and loving it. It means loving God and loving people. It means helping those in need and being a light to everyone around us. Friends, this is a long journey, and I know it seems like we might not ever arrive. And I know it seems like there are things that are too far gone, but hold on to hope. There's a really special quote from St. Augustine that speaks really well here that says, "The things that have rotted in you will flower again, and all the afflictions that make you sluggish will be healed, and the things that are slack will be remade and renewed and hold together with you." There's going to be days when life hits us hard and nothing seems to be working, but I remember these words often. Despite failure and trauma, God is making me new each and every morning, and God is doing the same in you. So please rest in that hope. God is doing a work in us that we could not believe or think of in our wildest dreams, and God is not through with us yet. We're on this path of being prepared for heaven with God as our guide. So how is God preparing you?